Welcome to the next installment of the Hannah Arendt Center's virtual reading group. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center. Today, we're going to begin to read Hannah Arendt's essay on violence, originally published in 1969 in the New York Review of Books. On violence is divided into three parts. We are going to have three sessions on the essay, on part 1, part 2, and part 3. Hannah Arendt doesn't give titles to the three parts, but if you wanted to try and understand it, part 1 is on why violence is important today and why Hannah Arendt actually thinks that our interest in violence is misplaced. Part 2 is a series of definitional moves that tries to distinguish violence from power, as well as violence from strength and force, and to argue that power rather than violence is the more important political idea. And part 3 is on the failure of power in the modern 20th century and now 21st century. And the argument is that the rise of theories and interests in violence as a political means is largely a result of the retreat of power. And while this can be effective at times, it is often quite dangerous. And so that's the overarching structure of the essay. Today, I'm going to largely exclusively focus on part 1. And to do so, I'm going to pick out 5 quotations from the essay. We'll put them on the screen. You can look at them, and I'll say a little bit about them. It's worthwhile starting actually at the end, I think, or the beginning and the end. So the essay begins with a famous quotation from Lenin that the 20th century will be an age of violence and war, revolution, and violence. And Arendt says, while this may seem to have been the case, the focus on violence has actually been misplaced. It's unjustified. And she's going to go into a number of reasons why, one of which is this argument that actually, rather than just violence, what we should think about is the technology behind increased violence. But let's turn to the end of the book, the very end of the book. There's 2 different editions the book is usually read in. If you're using the essay in the Crises of the Republic book, we're on page 132 to 133. And if you're using the On Violence special edition, we're on page 31. And what Arendt says here at the end is violence in the shape of war and revolution may appear to constitute the only possible interruption. Interruption here of sort of the unstoppable processes of corruption, technology, environmental decay, imperialism, the processes that she finds deeply worrisome and politically risky and dangerous in the world, and that these seem unstoppable. And violence, terrorism, seems like one way to stop them, one way to interrupt these unstoppable processes. And she writes, if this were true, if only the practice of violence would make it possible to interrupt automatic processes in the realm of human affairs, the preachers of violence would have won an important point. So if it were true that violence is the only way, the only possible interruption of these political processes, then we may need to justify violence. But she continues, it is the function, however, of all action, as distinguished from mere behavior, to interrupt what otherwise would have proceeded automatically and therefore predictably. The point here is that violence is not the only way to interrupt the processes of politics that we find dangerous. There is action, and action is connected to power. Power is the action of a group of people acting together in concert to achieve common political ends. And so you'll now get to see, I hope, where the book is going to move, which is to say that we are going to say that there are other ways to interrupt and to act politically rather than through violence, namely by the development and nurturing of power. To turn back to the beginning of this particular essay, the path through the essay is somewhat complicated. It's written in a way that is sometimes, I think, potentially hard to follow. But what we need to understand is that violence can't be looked at simply in the abstract, because violence, as she says, needs implements. It needs technologies. And she says this on page 6 or page 108. 108 if you're using the Crisis in the Republic edition. And what she says is, under these circumstances, the circumstances are those in which violence has increased and become increasingly technologically destructive. There are indeed few things that are more frightening than the steadily increasing prestige of scientifically minded brain trusters in the councils of government during the last decades. The trouble is not that they are cold-blooded enough to think the unthinkable, but that they do not think. Instead of indulging in such an old-fashioned, uncomputerizable activity, they reckon with the consequences of certain hypothetically assumed constellations, without, however, being able to test their hypotheses against actual occurrences. What she's saying here is that violence, as it becomes ever more extreme with nuclear bombs and other machine guns and other aspects of technology, it needs justification. And as we increasingly seek to justify it, we bring into government people whose talent and skill and training are in justifying, namely scientifically minded brain trusters. These people who are schooled at and capable of making arguments for the use of violence. She's very critical of these people. She cites at the bottom of the page here 2 articles who are critical of these people, one by Noam Chomsky and one by Richard Goodwin. And the point here is that in justifying the violence of the Vietnam War, which is what these 2 essays are about, or in justifying the violence of the redistributive welfare state, which Chomsky also talks about in his book, these pseudoscientists who try to give clear and convincing and logical justifications for violence ignore the fact that the world is complicated and that events happen in ways that we can't predict. She cites Proudhon at the bottom of the page. The fecundity of the unexpected far exceeds the statement's prudence, by which she means that no matter how intelligent, scientific, and rational we are, unexpected things will happen, and the attempt to justify war, imperialism, whatever violent aim you're going to try and pursue is dangerous because, and here's the other quote I want to read on page 109 or page 7. She says, the most obvious and most profound objection to this kind of strategic theory, this justifying of violence, is not its limited usefulness, but its danger. For it can lead us to believe that we have an understanding of events and control over their flow, which we do not have. It makes us, she says, fall asleep. It hypnotizes us. It makes us think that we humans can master violence and control it and use it in productive ways to make the world better. She says on the next page, because of their inner consistency of these arguments by these scientifically minded brain trusters, they have a hypnotic effect. They put to sleep our common sense, which is nothing else but our mental organ for perceiving, understanding, and dealing with the reality and factuality. The desire to use violence leads to the rationalization of violence, which makes us believe wrongly that we can control violence so that we can improve and change the world. And she says this is dangerous because it makes us feel like supermen. And we then will engage in grandiose projects that will be devastating. And that is the critique she's making here. There's then a long section of the first chapter of the essay, where she asks the question, well, why did this desire for violence emerge in the 20th century? It wasn't always there. It's a fairly new phenomena. And she says that if you read Marx, you'll see that Marx, talks about violence, but for Marx, violence is always a marginal phenomena. He's really talking about the social and political developments which drive history, and violence is simply one way to help those developments drive history. It's not what actually leads to the changes. She says it's also not Sartre. Sartre speaks about violence as if it's often going to remake the human soul, that violence can cleanse us, in a sense, make us exist in a way that we never existed before. And she's critical of both the New Left wrongful interpretation of Marx and the Sartrean idea that we can reinvent ourselves through violence, as if we make ourselves. She says we don't make ourselves, we're given. We're made by someone else. And it's, again, a kind of hubris to think that we're going to make ourselves through anything, let alone violence. But she does say, and here we get to where the essay really picks up again, on page 117 to 118 in Crisis of the Republic, or page 15 to 16 in the book on violence. She begins to talk about what she calls an experience. And this is very usual for Arendt. Violence and the turn towards violence in the 20th century doesn't come out of ideas or concepts. It comes out of an experience, as she says. And she says at the bottom of page 115, no doubt all this has a logic of its own, but it is one springing from experience, and this experience was utterly unknown to any generation before. The pathos and the elan of the New Left, their credibility, as it were, are closely connected with the weird suicidal development of modern weapons. This is the first generation to grow up under the shadow of the atom bomb. So it's under the shadow of the atom bomb. It's under this sense of impending doom that the desire, that the new glorification for violence emerges. And on page 117 to 118, page 15 to 16, she writes this: a social common denominator of the movement, namely the movement for violence, seems out of the question. But it is true that psychologically, this generation seems everywhere characterized by sheer courage, an astounding will to action, and by a no less astounding confidence in the possibility of change. This generation, these are the student protesters of the 60s primarily. And what she's saying is that these students, in the shadow of the atom bomb, in the shadow of what she calls the possibility of doomsday, this feeling that the environment is going to destroy us, that politics has been destroyed by corruption, that even human beings are going to be overcome by technology and transhumanism and a kind of singularity, which is an idea she's already been thinking about in the 1950s, long before she wrote this essay. It's in the face of this kind of doom, young people are characterized by a kind of courage, a sheer courage, a will to action, and by this unbelievable sense of the possibility of change. And this emergence of this feeling, of this experience, leads them to say we have to stop what's happening. We have to stop these processes of imperialism, environmental degradation, transhumanism, corruption. And on page 120 in Christ and the Republic, and page 18 of the On Violence book, she writes, to the often heard question, who are they, this new generation? One is tempted to answer, those who hear the ticking of the bomb, doomsday. And to the other question, who are they who utterly deny them? The answer may well be those who do not know or refuse to face things as they really are. Which calls to mind one of her favorite ideas expressed for the first time in the essay, in the book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she writes that comprehension is the unpremeditated and attentive facing up to and resisting of reality, whatever it may be. And what she's saying is that in some sense, the student protesters, the student movement, in their embrace of violence, which was confused, she argues, and problematic in many ways, were facing up to a basic reality of our time, which is that the bombs are ticking, that there are processes that have been set in motion that are threatening the human condition. And it's in response to that violence becomes thematized and becomes important in the 20th century, which brings us to the end of this chapter, which I began with, which is that she says there was a sense that violence was the only possible interruption of these processes. And if that were the case, then we would have to think strongly about violence. But as she says, violence is not the only interruption of these processes. It's not the only way to stave off impending doomsday. There's also action, which is developed through political power. And that's what we will talk about next time in part 2 of this essay, where she distinguishes violence from power. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you, and enjoy reading Arendt.